The desert sun of early February 2026 beat down mercilessly on the private tarmac of Dubai International Airport. But inside the sleek Gulfstream G650, the atmosphere was a tense mix of anticipation and expectation. Meghan Markle had traveled thousands of miles, expecting a seamless passage through the corridors of privilege she had cultivated over the past 6 years. Her entourage, a small, meticulously curated team, whispered updates, checked schedules, and ensured every detail adhered to the invisible choreography of high-status arrivals. But as the plane taxied to a halt, a strange void greeted them. No black SUVs, no pre-cleared passage, no waiting dignitaries. The absence was deafening, and the first subtle alarm went unnoticed, even by those trained to detect the faintest disruption in protocol. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you watch these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and keeps you up to date as everything unfolds. And while you're here, let us know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. It's wonderful to see viewers joining us from around the world. Stepping onto the tarmac, Meghan's heels clicked with the confidence of someone used to influence, someone who had learned to bend the world's attention in her favor. Yet the silence of the airport was a subtle rebuke, a quiet challenge that even the most polished image could not navigate without consequence. Every moment stretched the tension, each second dripping with the weight of expectation versus reality. The Emirati officers who eventually appeared were polite, professional, and utterly immovable, a combination that carried far more authority than noise ever could. Meghan's credentials were reviewed with clinical detachment, each glance a reminder that influence is conditional, fragile, and earned, not assumed. Inside the private holding area, the clock became the first adversary. 1 hour passed, then 2. Time in this environment is a currency of validation, and for every minute spent waiting, the perceived power of a global duchess diminished imperceptibly but irrevocably. Staff whispered among themselves, their expressions carefully neutral, but the tension was tangible. They understood the rules, they had been trained for these moments. Yet even they could sense the delicate fracture occurring as the veneer of status met the immutable boundaries of sovereign discretion. Outside, the desert shimmered in white-hot sunlight, indifferent to the private drama unfolding within its gates. Meghan reached for the one lever she believed could recalibrate the situation: her connection to the British crown. 6 years of careful positioning, a name that carried the weight of history, and a carefully curated brand. All of it was meant to transform expectation into reality. But Dubai operates on different rules where the endorsement of a reigning monarch is not a ceremonial gesture, but the foundation upon which all privilege is constructed. Attempting to invoke authority without the active support of the crown was a miscalculation, a subtle misalignment between perception and operational reality. Each minute spent in negotiation, though calm and measured on the surface, echoed the underlying tension, the slow realization that influence can evaporate in silence, that doors can close without ceremony, and that titles alone cannot compel recognition. The first crack appeared not in words, but in the psychology of presence. Meghan, used to environments that bend to expectation, now faced a system impervious to charm, brand, and historical association. The room's cool sterility, the precise order of procedural steps, and the absence of any acknowledgement beyond necessity created a subtle psychological pressure cooker. It was in these moments experts note that true power, or its absence, reveals itself. Each procedural delay, each neutral glance from an officer, became a signal louder than any headline. Outside observers, should they have been watching, would have missed it entirely. But for those inside, the unfolding tension was palpable, a reminder that authority without backing is not a shield, it is a hollow echo. By the third hour, Meghan's team had begun to fray at the edges. Each phone call, each whispered negotiation, only underscored the immutability of the Emirates' decision. The quiet protocol that defines access to Dubai had not failed. It had functioned exactly as designed, enforcing boundaries without spectacle, asserting sovereignty without confrontation. And yet, beneath the calm, the high-stakes narrative was shifting. Every delay was a subtle lesson in the limits of perception, a signal to the world that the Sussex brand, powerful though it appeared, could not compel compliance where real authority resided. Finally, when the decision was conveyed, the denial of entry, the impact was not theatrical but seismic in its implications. There would be no luxury suite at the Burj Al Arab, no curated meetings with the city's power brokers, no ceremonial recognition. The rejection was both literal and symbolic, a quiet assertion that influence is conditional, reputations are fragile, and even a duchess can encounter immutable boundaries. Meghan's reaction, though internally turbulent, was outwardly composed, the kind of restraint that masks strategic calculation. Every move from this point would be measured not just by immediate impact, but by the long arc of global perception, the subtle ways in which narrative, brand, and history intersect. Within London, whispers of the Dubai moment began to circulate almost immediately, filtered through diplomatic channels and palace intermediaries. The palace, for its part, remained outwardly silent, but the silence itself carried weight, a quiet signal that would ripple through the corridors of influence. The denial of entry was more than a logistical inconvenience. It was a catalyst, a single event that illuminated fractures in perception, alliances, and strategy. Observers in the palace would soon recognize that the event required careful calibration. One misstep could transform a procedural rejection into a headline-grabbing scandal. One mismanaged response could shift public sympathy. One delayed statement could compound the subtle erosion of influence. By the time the Gulf Stream lifted from the runway, the Dubai moment had already begun to redefine the parameters of Meghan's power. A global audience, even if unaware of the intricate procedural details, would sense the disruption. The absence of ceremony, the clinical enforcement of protocol, and the precise timing of communications combined to deliver a message louder than any press release. Authority is not a gift of perception. It is the enforcement of reality. The flight back, ostensibly a retreat, was in fact the start of a new narrative, one that would unfold over weeks and months, touching every aspect of influence, family, and personal brand that Meghan had meticulously curated. And as the desert skyline receded beneath the wings of the jet, an open loop remained. What would the palace do next? How would the world interpret this silent rebuke? And most importantly, how would Meghan navigate the uncharted territory where perception no longer aligns with the immutable rules of power? The questions hovered, unanswered, as the plane soared toward a city that had become, in that moment, a mirror of what happens when influence meets immutable authority. Every whisper, every calculated silence, and every decision yet to be revealed would compound the tension, setting the stage for the cascade of consequences that was about to begin. The quiet tension of Dubai had barely settled when London's corridors of power braced for the ripples that inevitably followed. Within the palace, the air was thick with expectation and unspoken calculation. Camilla, Queen Consort, moved through these halls with practiced subtlety, a blend of grace and quiet ambition that masked the sharp edge of territorial assertion. The moment Meghan's disrupted arrival became known, Camilla's influence began to assert itself, not with open confrontation, but with the kind of strategic overreach that could reshape alliances before anyone realized the ground had shifted. By mid-morning, the palace's private communications network was alive with discreet alerts, subtle instructions, and carefully coded reminders of protocol. Camilla, seated in a sunlit study lined with oak paneling, reviewed the unfolding situation with the precision of a chess master considering multiple moves ahead. Each message she received carried layers of implication: a note about media preparedness, a briefing on potential public perception, a subtle warning from aides who sensed that authority was being tested. The threads of influence were fine, but tightly woven, and Camilla knew that a single misstep could unravel them entirely. Yet she pressed forward, confident that momentum favored the side already deeply embedded in the palace's operational hierarchy. The first manifestation of her overreach arrived in the form of subtle directives, distributed to a network of aides and secretaries, each designed to assert control over narrative, access, and influence. Meetings that had once been routine were suddenly rerouted, invitations quietly rescinded, and communications filtered through layers of gatekeepers. The palace itself, in its veneer of stability, was revealing fissures. Meghan's Dubai moment had illuminated an opportunity, a chance for Camilla to reassert dominance over the mechanisms of power, to subtly rewrite the map of influence in her favor, and to ensure that her authority remained unchallenged. Staff, even those who had served decades under multiple monarchs, sensed the shift. The subtle acceleration of protocol, the recalibration of access points, and the carefully measured language of memos created a psychological environment where every choice, no matter how minor, carried weight. Meghan, far removed in Dubai at first, could not yet fully gauge the scale of these adjustments. But in London, every whisper, every strategic placement, and every rearrangement of influence was being observed, catalogued, and silently leveraged. The palace's internal dynamics, usually shielded from public scrutiny, were now a stage for a high-stakes contest that would define reputations and recalibrate allegiances. By afternoon, the tension began to crystallize. Camilla convened a series of discreet discussions with senior advisors, carefully framing the narrative to emphasize continuity, stability, and the protection of royal prerogatives. Each conversation, though outwardly procedural, carried an unspoken agenda: to tighten control, to contain potential disruption, and to preempt any perception that power had slipped. Aides circulated quietly, balancing loyalty to their direct chain of command with an awareness that history would remember even minor concessions. Every adjustment, every controlled leak of information, was designed to reinforce Camilla's position while creating an environment where Meghan's options appeared increasingly constrained. Meanwhile, palace insiders who were more sympathetic to Meghan began to sense the tightening grip. Subtle messages, hints of reassignment, and the withdrawal of previously available channels of communication signaled a reordering of priorities. The tension was invisible to the casual observer, but inside the palace the pressure was tangible. Alliances were being tested. Staff had to decide, often in moments of rapid judgment, which side of the emerging fault line they would occupy. Misalignment could mean lost access, diminished influence, or public misinterpretation. Every choice carried consequences not only for reputation, but also for survival within the finely tuned ecosystem of palace politics. By late evening, Camilla's strategy had achieved an almost imperceptible perfection. Every element of influence, from ceremonial appearances to media narratives, had been nudged subtly to favor her position. The palace's response to Meghan's Dubai incident was no longer reactive. It was proactive, shaping perception before the world even understood the event had occurred. The calculated overreach was deliberate. It would not provoke immediate confrontation, but would compound the pressure on Meghan, forcing her into a landscape where decisions were measured not by intention, but by consequence. Every silent pause in communication, every denied request, and every carefully curated public signal served as an instrument of control. The impact on palace morale was immediate. Some aides, loyal to traditional hierarchies, felt vindicated. Others, aware of the potential public fallout, grew increasingly anxious. Camilla's actions, though unspoken in public, began to generate internal commentary, subtly shaping perceptions among staff and insiders alike. The palace was not a single organism but a network of influence, and by manipulating nodes of authority, Camilla ensured that Meghan's position was subtly and increasingly precarious. And yet beneath the polished surface of control, open loops persisted. How far would Meghan push back? Which allies would she mobilize? Could the Sussex brand withstand the compounding pressure of protocol, silence, and subtle isolation? Camilla's overreach had set a trap, but its full consequences were not yet visible. For the palace, the stakes were immense. A mismanaged reaction could ignite a cascade of public speculation, while for Meghan, the moment demanded strategic calculation, resilience, and the ability to navigate the unseen currents that now defined her access, her influence, and her perception in the corridors of power. The tension hung, deliberate and precise, as the palace exhaled into the night, every shadow and whispered instruction contributing to a landscape where perception and authority were poised for a collision that would soon define the arc of events to come. The subtle chessboard of palace influence had shifted, and the consequences were beginning to manifest with an intensity that no aide, no insider, and no royal observer could ignore. By the first light of morning, Harry and Meghan had returned to London from Dubai, stepping into an environment that was deceptively calm. To the casual eye, the palace appeared untouched, velvet drapes, polished floors, and the quiet hum of staff performing familiar routines. But beneath the surface, a storm had been meticulously engineered. The ripple that had begun with Meghan's disrupted arrival now surged through corridors, offices, and private studies, leaving tension in its wake that seemed almost tangible. Harry, attuned to nuance through years of exposure to the subtleties of royal protocol, felt it immediately. Invitations that once had been automatic were now filtered through layers of oversight. Meetings were delayed without explanation, emails left unanswered, and couriers returned with messages marked as for review rather than delivered directly. Allies, those who had been loyal to both Sussex's and palace tradition, began to vanish from schedules or arrive only in fragmented segments, unable to provide consistent support. The isolation was surgical, and the faint, almost imperceptible smile in Camilla's communications hinted that each adjustment was intentional, a carefully measured assertion of dominance that had now become impossible to ignore. Meghan sensed the same undercurrent. She understood in a visceral way that she had entered a landscape where her presence alone was a vector of tension. Every smile received, every nod in a corridor, and every official interaction carried dual meanings: what was said and what was withheld. Palace insiders began to choose sides quietly. Some aligned themselves with Camilla, reassured by her command of narrative and her ability to project stability, while others lingered on the fence, waiting for a decisive signal that might shift their loyalty without jeopardizing their own standing. For Meghan and Harry, the calculation became immediate: how to assert agency without inflaming a delicate equilibrium that could tip against them in public view, and how to leverage their global influence in a system designed to favor the familiar and the entrenched. The tension reached a new pitch in the first private meeting with senior aides. The room, dimly lit, carried a faint aroma of polished oak and subtle citrus, a controlled environment designed to soothe and impress, yet for Meghan and Harry, it only amplified the sense of being on display. Words were chosen carefully, every phrase scrutinized, every hesitation noted. A shift in tone, a micro-expression, or an unspoken pause could be interpreted as approval or dissent, loyalty or challenge. Harry felt the weight of scrutiny pressing on him, knowing that every choice would be amplified beyond the walls of the study. Meghan, equally perceptive, recognized that the palace's instruments of influence were now not just formal, but psychological, shaping perception and expectations simultaneously. As the hours stretched, alliances began to fracture. Aides who had once coordinated access for Sussex projects quietly redirected resources, subtly undermining scheduling and limiting opportunities to influence the narrative. Private communications, once direct, were now filtered through layers of control that Harry and Meghan could not immediately penetrate. The subtle erosion of operational independence was deliberate, methodical, and difficult to counteract without drawing attention. The Sussexes were not being excluded entirely. Rather, they were being placed in a carefully calibrated tension where every move carried consequence, and every decision could be leveraged as evidence of instability. The media, though initially unaware of the internal realignment, began to detect the strain. Brief, cryptic statements released from official channels hinted at restructuring, advisory adjustments, and realignments of focus. Observers outside the palace, attuned to patterns and history, began to speculate on friction, although the full scope remained obscured. Within the palace, however, the reality was unmistakable. Meghan's authority had been challenged, Harry's influence was being tested, and the insider network that had once been receptive was now cautiously circumspect. The careful balance of public and private perception, once aligned, had fractured under the weight of internal recalibration. By evening, the tension escalated toward crisis. A key meeting with senior stakeholders in global initiatives had been postponed indefinitely. Harry's attempt to secure clarity was met with oblique responses, emails that required multiple levels of approval, and veiled references to protocol that, when unpacked, reinforced the implicit constraint on their agency. Meghan, meanwhile, navigated parallel channels, seeking allies among those who had remained neutral. Every interaction carried dual layers of meaning. the official, and the tactical. Every ally's choice, every observed hesitation began to compound the sense of isolation, forcing a strategic reevaluation. The crisis reached its psychological peak during a late-night discussion between Harry and Meghan in their private quarters. The conversation, intense and unguarded, revealed the emotional toll of the palace's calculated maneuvers. Every shift, every delay, every subtle obstruction was designed to force a response, but a response that could be criticized, misconstrued, or weaponized. The Sussexes recognized that the crisis was no longer a matter of scheduling or public optics. It had become an existential test of their ability to navigate a system designed to marginalize dissent while projecting stability. And yet open loops remained. Which allies would ultimately take decisive action? How far could Camilla's overreach continue without triggering backlash? Could Meghan and Harry recalibrate, reclaiming influence without inflaming tensions into irreversible rupture? The palace's network of perception and control, now fully operational, created a landscape where every choice, every word, and every signal was loaded with consequence. As the night deepened, Harry and Meghan understood that they had entered a battle defined less by public spectacle and more by psychological precision. A battle in which victory would require anticipation, restraint, and the careful orchestration of influence across a field that extended from gilded corridors to the global media stage. The suspense, subtle and unrelenting, set the stage for the final act, a confrontation of alliances, a resolution of tension, and the revelation of consequences that would shape perception far beyond palace walls. Each shadow, each whispered instruction, and each carefully timed communication was a prelude to a climactic moment where the balance of power, loyalty, and reputation would finally demand reckoning. The story, poised on the precipice of resolution, left observers and insiders alike aware that the next move would define not only the outcome, but the very architecture of influence for years to come. The final hours of the unfolding crisis moved with a gravity that felt almost tangible. The palace, usually a monument to ritual and predictable cadence, had transformed into a stage for unseen negotiations, quiet maneuvers, and psychological brinkmanship. Harry and Meghan, attuned to nuance as never before, recognized that the equilibrium they had sought to maintain could no longer exist in its previous form. Every corridor whispered consequence, every staff member's glance suggested judgment, and every official communication was a vector for influence, subtle, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, key allies had made their positions unmistakable. Some who had lingered on the sidelines now aligned openly with Meghan, motivated not by personal loyalty, but by recognition of shifting power dynamics and the consequences of exclusion. Others, long supporters of the palace's traditional hierarchy, doubled down on allegiance to Camilla and the mechanism she had so meticulously orchestrated. The palace itself, a network of interlocking authority and perception, began to hum with the tension of these divergent alignments. Every interaction became a statement, every gesture a signal, and every delay a potential pivot point for influence. In a carefully scheduled series of meetings, Harry and Meghan confronted the structural friction head-on. Meghan, poised and deliberate, presented her initiatives with clarity and confidence, weaving a narrative that highlighted their shared objectives while subtly exposing the inefficiencies and biases that had constrained their access. Harry complemented this approach with strategic precision, signaling through tone, timing, and presence that their influence was neither incidental nor negotiable. The palace, confronted with evidence, optics, and global perception, had no choice but to adjust. The careful choreography of exclusion began to yield under the weight of measured pressure, and the balance of authority subtly shifted. Camilla, confronted with the recalibration of influence, recognized the limits of unilateral maneuvering. Her overreach, once an invisible undercurrent, had become explicit and subject to scrutiny. Privately, advisors who had previously deferred to her discretion began offering candid assessments of potential fallout, making it clear that unchecked assertion risked destabilizing not only protocol but perception. The subtle networks that maintained control began to fracture under the strain of visible alignment toward Meghan and Harry. Even as Camilla sought to maintain composure and narrative control, the palace's own architecture forced accommodation, compromise, and recalibration. By late afternoon, the crisis had reached its apex. A public statement, carefully drafted and strategically timed, reflected the new equilibrium. Meghan and Harry's projects were officially recognized, their influence acknowledged, and the underlying tensions addressed without spectacle. Allies on all sides understood that compromise was not capitulation, but the recognition of shifting dynamics within a system designed to monitor, measure, and respond to influence. The palace, far from being weakened, had adapted. Its internal narrative recalibrated to absorb the disruption without collapsing the outward image of stability. The subtle victory, however, was accompanied by an acknowledgement of ongoing complexity. Harry and Meghan, while having secured agency, recognized that every future move would remain under scrutiny. The lessons of the crisis, how perception can be weaponized, how influence can be constrained or redirected, and how alliances form and fracture in silence, would inform strategy for years to come. Camilla, meanwhile, retained her stature and role, but the boundaries of her assertion had been tested and clarified. The recalibration left the palace more resilient, more perceptive, and acutely aware that equilibrium is never permanent but constantly negotiated. As evening descended, the corridors returned to a semblance of normalcy. Staff resumed routines, schedules realigned, and the subtle orchestration of influence moved into a steady cadence. Outside, global observers noted announcements and statements, interpreting them in fragments, unaware of the delicate psychological and strategic resolutions that had just occurred. Within, Harry and Meghan reflected on the culmination of weeks of tension, understanding that clarity had been achieved not through confrontation alone, but through precise navigation of the invisible forces that shape perception, loyalty, and consequence. The story, once poised on a knife edge of uncertainty, concluded with the balance of power defined, alliances clarified, and the threads of influence restored to a discernible order. The palace had survived the internal storm, its architecture of authority intact, but now enriched with the knowledge that even subtle overreach could trigger recalibration. For Harry and Meghan, the resolution was both tactical and existential. Influence regained, perception managed, and a clear path forward illuminated, demonstrating that even in the most controlled environments, agency, strategy, and presence could decisively shape outcomes. The final curtain fell with quiet precision. Open loops that had haunted corridors, conversations, and communications resolved, leaving no ambiguity about who held influence, where alliances lay, and what consequences awaited those who misjudged the balance. The crisis, fully confronted and conclusively managed, left observers, insiders, and the Sussexes themselves with a singular understanding. In a world defined by perception and hierarchy, clarity emerges not through spectacle but through deliberate action, subtle pressure, and the patient orchestration of influence. The palace and those within it had learned a profound truth. Authority is dynamic, perception is powerful, and resolution is a carefully navigated journey, one that requires patience, insight, and unwavering attention to every subtle signal.